You know, something we hear a lot about, and a word we use a lot, and a concept we use a lot, is the idea of karma. People use the idea and word freely as if it was something really important in our mainstream culture, in Western culture. And actually, it isn't. It's something that we've gradually absorbed by osmosis one way or another, certainly as karma and as we use it in the modern sense. And so, as an astrologer whose stock in trade is actually working with some of the original traditional ideas of karma, I thought this would be a great time to have a look at those and just clarify, what is that original idea of karma? Is it the same as what we call fate? And what does it really tell us? What is karma? So, of course, that word karma is a Sanskrit word, and actually, of course, is very much placed within the Hindu and Vedic traditions. And we're not exactly talking about that, or certainly not about that context. The important thing is that's come to be the word that we now understand for that concept, because of course we have really inherited that concept from Vedic and Hindu culture. But it's not actually so recent that we inherited it. There was a lot of intellectual contact between ancient India and ancient Greece. The idea of karma was really to explain why we experience things the way that we do. What is the balance between our free will and an outside force that seems to shape much of what happens to us? Whether we call that God or nature or something else, there certainly is a notable absence in a lot of free will in much of what we do. There's a notable absence of control over much of what happens to us. In fact, not very much of it seems to be under our control at all. For millennia, people have debated free will versus fate. And that is not the debate we're engaging in tonight. We don't really want to worry about the quantity of free will or what exactly that is all about. And that's why I want to also start by saying that karma and fate are not exactly the same thing. Fate, the concept that's explained in Western culture and that is often in that debate of free will versus fate or destiny or something like that, is a little bit different and is a discussion for a different time. Let's take it that we more or less would agree that there is a varying relationship between fate and free will in our human experience, and we could argue about how much of each, but on the whole and on average there seems to be a varied relationship between how much we're in control of and how much we aren't. So it's not so much about those individual little ingredients that we're really concerned, but that what is this energy, what is this process that drives a lot of what happens to me that I'm not in control of. That includes our personalities, and it includes a lot of why astrologers are able to do what they do, because astrology is not a psychic science where people divine information more or less out of thin air, but it's really an attempt to mathematically model the human experience and its cycles. And underlying that, there is the experience of the individual human being or soul or consciousness, whatever exactly it is, that is going through this process, this mysterious process of life. The real thing about karma, the real usefulness of the idea of karma to us, is that it is a rational approach to understanding this play of non-control, of the power of the past and who we're born as over us. It is a rational approach that does not require a religious approach or a religion or even any particular type of being to control it. In the West, we often portray karma as if it had something to do with reward and punishment. We really are reinterpreting the idea of karma according to Western culture and Western religious culture. In the Western religious culture, you have the idea of a God that rewards and punishes. And so we tend to interpret karma as being the same way. We see karma as a kind of a result, a comeuppance of something. People even in Western culture talk about instant karma, or not only so a result that happens immediately, and people say instant karma, or even otherwise they'll say this is karma for what he did to me 5 years ago. And we comfortably use that, and that's what I meant in the intro by the comfortable use of this word, as if we've got this understanding of karma, when in fact all we're doing is using different words for our already well-established Western religious cultural view of punishment and reward as how God or Spirit works with us. The view of karma is not a view of punishment and reward. It's not an idea of a God that likes and dislikes what you do. It's really about an energy that you as a conscious being, perhaps part of God, but that you as a conscious being express. It's an idea of energy that allows us to take a more rational understanding of what exactly is the process that's being described here. If we are like everything else on this planet, and we pretty much are mostly, we're alive and we go through life and growth and death and all different cycles strongly related to the earth itself, which is exactly like everything else on this planet, well then probably our consciousness also is a lot like how everything else in life and nature and physics and the cosmos tends to work. Because while the ancient metaphysicists might have said, as above, so below, the ancient scientists believed that there was a connection between everything, so we can even see with our modern lenses that things operate according to certain basic principles. So in the idea of energy, because I'm saying that the idea really was that karma was a kind of an energy. In the idea of energy, we have principles that we understand, for example, that when energy is applied in one direction, there is a force that responds in the other direction. And we know that energy is neither created nor destroyed, that the universe is a fixed quantity of energy. So energy just changes form. All of these concepts must presumably apply to our lives and to consciousness just as they apply to everything else. Why would we be exempt? So we don't know what consciousness is. We can't explain what life and consciousness is, but it presumably is a kind of an energy, even like everything else is. It's the mysterious ingredient in life that unmistakably has qualities of its own, but that can't be well understood or well explained in the ideas of physics and biology. But let's just assume it is some kind of energy that we're not able to describe with our physics and biology yet. It's still going to behave like the other kinds of energy. So when we die, the physical energies of our bodies dissipate in all sorts of different ways. Heat dissipates, and movement energy will dissipate. That dissipation is a quality of energy. Energy seeks to dissipate itself. It's called entropy. Energy is all crumbling itself down to the lowest common denominator. It's why things die and crumble and fall apart, and why that's what energy is always seeking to do. It's like if you heat up one corner of the room, the heat is going to gradually dissipate to the rest of the room. That is the energy-seeking entropy. So when we die, a lot of the energies of our bodies do that. But what does consciousness do? Consciousness isn't heat, and it isn't light. It isn't an energy that dissipates itself, because we know it's not a floating energy in space, like light can be or like heat can be. It isn't one of those energies floating around. It's obviously of a different nature that we don't quite know how to describe, but we assume must be behaving the same way. So that means it's going to seek entropy. And since it can't dissipate itself out into space, it obviously needs a human form or a living form to be, in order to do what it needs to do, in this case, to seek entropy. So in order for consciousness to translate itself into the world, to do something, to desire something, to anything, and even to seek entropy, it takes the form of physical life. We don't know how it does that. We just know that somehow things that are born have consciousness. Just speaking for ourselves now. When we are born, we have consciousness. We don't entirely understand why. It might be the soul, it might be a quality of the body, it might be something completely different. It might be that we're reflections or fragments of the divine. We've had so many ways, and many more than that, in our cultures to explain that. But it's that. So I can't say which one it is, but it's that. And that consciousness energy is the one I'm referring to. So then I can say, in order to seek entropy, consciousness must take form, it must be born. So whether we can, let's call that incarnation, you can also just call it birth. By whatever process, birth includes consciousness, that consciousness finds itself back in a physical form. It somehow attaches or becomes connected to physical form that is being created, of course, in somebody's body. And takes birth as consciousness with will and intention and all of those things that human beings have. And in their lives, their actions will, well, I'd love to say, seek entropy, because that's what's driving them. But as we seek entropy, we engage in other actions, and we build up more energy. Why do we build up energy? Well, one of the other principles of energy, as I said earlier on, is every time you put energy in one direction, it will return in the other direction. When we push on something, its molecular structure and the energy in its molecules push back, and we can feel it's solid or whatever its form is. Every action having an equal and opposite reaction accounts for that. So as we act on the world with our consciousness energy, there must be consciousness energy coming back at us. Well, there's no such thing. As I just said, there isn't consciousness floating around in space. It hasn't got a shape. It isn't another human being. So how does energy respond to us? It can't. So it gets stored. Energy can be stored. It can be stored in a battery. It can be stored in a spring, like when you wind up an old clock or toy car or something like that. So the energy becomes stored in our being somehow. And when we die, that energy is seeking entropy. And so the process of birth happens. And the process of birth happens, we arrive in the world and we're seeking entropy. And we act, our actions driven by consciousness, driven by forces we can't entirely understand, seeks entropy, but in the process keeps on doing actions that create more need for a return of action. And can't happen, so creates more actions that get stored, and stored in the battery or stored in the spring. And so it goes from life to life. As we get in through a life and we act in the world in order to release our energy, our thought, our will, consciousness, to release that into the world, it creates results and more energy is stored. So we have to get born again. And so consciousness can release itself into the world, seeking entropy. That has results and reactions, and it gets stored, and so we get born again. And that's why the reincarnation, the cultures that believe in reincarnation, see it as an endless wheel. And it could be the endless wheel of nature and energy and other things that exist in our cosmos. But it fits within a rational way of understanding how our consciousness energy works as one of the energies, and how reincarnation or consciousness or the human cycle can eventually be modeled and understood a little bit through things like astrology and other tools. But most importantly, how we are driven by forces that are not just about our conscious control. We have conscious control, but we have these driving forces, such as our personalities and such as the stuff that happens to us. That is the entropy that's happening. That's the karma, as it were. And that's also then why there's, of course, no such thing as instant karma. Because whatever action you take, the result gets stored. It can't just pop out, because that would require some outside intelligence to say, aha, your punishment for this is that, or your equal result of this is that. Who says? How says? Who's monitoring that and how? It's simpler to understand it according to how we know energy does really operate, rather than suggesting that there's some other force required that says, I will return this karma. And you can see that's really just punishment and reward. We like to believe that there's a reward for what we do. We're brought up that way in our culture. Western culture is largely based around things like material results. And also, we know from our history, the idea of reward and punishment, especially in our religious history, very strongly in our concepts of God and our concepts of religion or reward and punishment. That's not universal. And it's not really in the ideas of karma per se. It may be in other ideas in those cultures, but it's not in the idea of karma, which is a self-maintaining system. It looks like reward and punishment if you judge what's happening. And, we can say with our moral and ethical human understandings, there is a natural way that the universe, in the sense of the cosmos, the total of all the energy of the world, does balance things out, but not in itself with a kind of a fairness that says, oh, you did something good, here's something good, you did something bad, here's something bad. All of that is types of energies of consciousness, and they, like other energies in the cosmos, naturally seek their balance. It's true, the result is good and bad experiences, and that's why it's not just really random, and it doesn't require an outside intelligence. But it is important to understand that you can't really have a result of an action within the same lifetime. It has to be stored and seek entropy in order to turn into action again, because there isn't some God or someone else who says, you've been good, here's the result, who sends that energy back to you in this model. So it doesn't require that. If we see in nature and the process of life and death and regeneration on Earth itself. So just like we go through that physically, our bodies die and regenerate as other physical things in the cosmos through all their atoms, so does consciousness. But I'm not talking about a little ghost of oneself that is floating around. I'm talking about consciousness as an energy in itself that we have, that we use, that we partake of, that is one of the things of the human experience. So why it's different to fate and destiny is that there isn't necessarily some script that you're following, and that's karma, that says this is the list of things that's going to happen to you, or that there's some outside force that says you cannot go down this road or you shall go down that road. It doesn't really include those ideas. It's a self-managing system that is a system of the cosmos that allows for consciousness in ways that perhaps other energy systems don't describe well. Ancient people seem to have understood that or been able to model their world that way. And it makes sense, and you don't need some particular religious explanation of the cosmos in order for reward and punishment to happen. It raises the question though, then is there good karma and bad karma, good behavior, bad karma, if there isn't an outside punishing and rewarding force behind it? And the answer is yes, there is. Because here's the problem. If we're seeking entropy, but it's an endless wheel, we're never getting it, it would be rather frustrating. So, and I mean, it presumably is if we just keep on coming back for more. So how would anything shift, or how would consciousness benefit from that? Let's assume that consciousness is trying to grow. That's a fair assumption. Everything else in the universe seems to be trying to grow. The slightest things grow given half a chance. Life will grow. So consciousness is part of life. So consciousness presumably wants to grow, whatever that means, but for consciousness. But presumably that's what it's doing. It's getting more somehow. This process isn't allowing that. So the process must be to try and increase the awareness of what's going on, so that you can more consciously control the actions, so that you don't keep on generating the same amount of stuff to store in your battery or your spring. So the solution, as suggested by the ancients, and maybe sought through their religions and philosophies, is you need to find a way to dissipate more of the energy than you're getting back, to burn more karma than you're creating. And if you do that, you'll eventually, you'll eventually have a negative balance of karma. You'll have burned it all off. The idea that we can burn off extra karma then requires some model to how do we do that. How do you burn off, dissipate more energy than you're creating? Traditionally, the answer is in three things. On the one hand, it's to do things which are essentially selfless, where they're not for any benefit or result from yourself, or result to yourself. So the more the thing that you're doing has nothing to do with results to you, the less results energy to you is coming. So selfless acts are the example that's given that, or acts that, any acts which are not about an outcome or result. Letting go of outcomes is the second principle. So doing things that are not for your own benefit is one. Letting go of any outcome would be two, because it means you stop some of that outcome energy coming back to you, because it's just not part of how you're dissipating the energy anymore. So some of it isn't allowing the comeback, and the energies just dissipate further out there because there wasn't a comeback. And the third principle is through spiritual life and spiritual acts. That's where we go away from the quasi-scientific rational explanation, what I'm talking about, and becomes up to you what your religious worldview is. That sincere spiritual acts are said to burn more karma. When you sincerely do things that are beyond the individual self, is one way to describe that, similar to the selflessness that I described earlier on. So that basic principle is something that helps us, again, dissipate out where we're not really having energy return to us in any particular kind of a way. When the karma actually does manifest in our lives as this force that propels us, the traditional idea then says there are three types of karma that we experience. There are those things that won't change no matter what we do. There are those things that will change with effort, and there are those things that will change easily. So the traditional view does not say then this force of entropy operating through you directs you like you're a puppet. No, consciousness is such an important ingredient that says consciousness will allow you to change stuff. Not all of it, and a lot of it's not easy. But the more you work consciously, detaching yourself from the outcomes, not worrying about the rewards, and really just working to break the loop and be more aware and change things so that you don't keep getting the same outcome, the more it will seem as if you're in control of your world. So again, most things are actually changeable. Only like some things are unchangeable. Some things with difficulty, some things with ease. I mean, it's saying that most things are somewhat changeable. It just makes the most sense that it's a spectrum of strengths. It's not a solid wall. And so in keeping with that basic principle, our basic principle of how energy flows means that the pattern it creates relative to the consciousness you now have in this lifetime is on the scale that says the more you can use your consciousness to minimize the results, the greater freedom you will keep on having, within the bounds of whatever is free and not free in your life. The traditional idea says if you understand the boundaries, those things that cannot be changed, then you have an enormous amount of freedom within, because you don't keep bashing your head against the wall, against the things you cannot change. That was the traditional view of karma, and that was the traditional view of astrology. The purpose of astrology was to identify for people what can be changed and what can't be changed to a greater and lesser extent, and to give you clearer parameters so that you can make better choices and act with greater freedom in the middle there. Once you understand the parameters, once you understand what's changeable and what isn't. Bottom line is, once we properly understand what karma is and how it works, we understand that it's a natural principle. And if we, as with all our sciences, if we better understand the natural principles of ourselves, we can manage our lives better and make better lives for ourselves. We've done that with so many of the physical sciences. We can do that with the spiritual part of ourselves as well. We human beings have consciousness. We don't need religions to explain them to ourselves. They come from within ourselves. And so, in the same way, once we understand how that works for ourselves, we can manage our own consciousness life better and make better choices that have better effects in our lives. There's certainly considerably many boxes that discussion opens than perhaps it closes, but hopefully you had some ideas there to think about. But for now, I think that's enough to chew up for one Friday night. See you next week.